47 letters were sent across a brutal ocean to a man drawing his final breaths in a military hospital. But Shiva expected nothing but tragic silence. Instead, months later, a heavy knock rattled her parlor door. Standing there was no lowly soldier, but a powerful lord bearing a devastating secret. Winter gripped the coastal village of Aylsham in November of 1854, freezing the cobblestones and driving the townsfolk indoors. Bathsheba Linfield, a woman of 24 with sharp, intelligent eyes and a quiet demeanor, found herself trapped by the frost and her familial duties. Caring for her ailing father, a retired clockmaker named Charles Linfield, consumed her days. Her only escape lay in the evening hours, seated at a small mahogany desk by the hearth, where she read voraciously. News from the Crimean War dominated the broadsheets detailing horrific conditions, freezing trenches, and military hospitals overflowing with the wounded. Reverend Harold Collins arrived at the Linfield cottage on a Tuesday, bringing with him a ledger bound in cracked leather. He sat by the fire, his face lined with the grief of his parish. He had come to ask for a profound favor. Several parishes in the diocese were organizing an effort to write to the soldiers stationed at the hospital in Scutari, Turkey. Many of these men were dying without family, without comfort, and without hope. Bathsheba, known for her beautiful penmanship and articulate mind, was tasked with writing to a specific soldier. His name was Corporal Tabitha Ridge of the 11th Hussars. Reverend Collins warned her gently not to expect a reply, nor to hold on to false hope. Corporal Ridge had suffered a severe chest wound from a musket ball and was plagued by a consumptive fever. The military doctors gave him mere weeks to live. Sitting alone in her dimly lit study that night, Bathsheba dipped her quill into the inkwell. She felt incredibly foolish and painfully inadequate. What could she possibly say to a dying man thousands of miles away? She began her first letter with formal stiffness, treating it as a civic duty rather than a human connection. Dear Corporal Ridge, I write to you from the village of Aylsham, under the request of our parish. I am told you have fought bravely for our nation, and for that we are eternally grateful. She sealed it with red wax, feeling a strange detachment from the words on the page. Penning the subsequent letters became an anchor in her isolated life. Every Wednesday and Saturday she drafted a new missive to send with a military post. By the 7th letter, the awkward formalities melted away. Bathsheba realized that a dying man did not need political updates or stiff gratitude. He needed life. He needed a reminder of the world he was leaving behind. She began to describe the world outside his hospital ward in vivid, colorful detail. She wrote about Mrs. Gable, the village baker who always burned the bottom of her sourdough loaves but sold them anyway with a cheerful smile. She wrote about Barnaby, the three-legged stray dog who had adopted the village square as his personal kingdom and chased away the local butcher's cats. She described the smell of the sea salt mingling with the pine trees, and the way the winter sun fractured through the stained glass of the local church on Sunday mornings. Weeks bled into months. Bathsheba reached her 20th letter. A strange, deeply intimate bond had formed in her mind. She found herself talking to Tabitha throughout her day, noting small details to include in her next writing. She began to pour her own insecurities onto the parchment. She confessed her fears of growing old in a house filled with ticking clocks, her suppressed desire to see the world beyond the cliffs of Aylsham, and the overwhelming loneliness that gripped her despite being surrounded by lifelong neighbors. She gave this unknown soldier the truest version of herself, secure in the tragic knowledge that her secrets would soon be buried with him. Enclosed within a battered envelope that arrived in late January was something that made Bathsheba's heart stop entirely. It was a reply, The handwriting was not robust, but rather a chaotic, hurried scrawl of someone barely clinging to consciousness. Sister Margaret, a nurse at Scutari, had penned the first half of the page, explaining that Corporal Ridge was running a terrible fever, but had frantically begged her to transcribe his words. The second half, written by Tabitha himself in a shaky, uneven hand, read, "Miss Linfield, your words are the only fire in this freezing hall. When I close my eyes, I can smell the pine and the sea salt. I can hear the ticking of your father's clocks. You have given a dead man a reason to open his eyes one more day. Please, I beg of you, do not stop writing." Moved to tears by the fragile ink on the page, Bathsheba wrote back that very night. Her letters grew longer, fiercely passionate and desperately hopeful. She wrote her 35th letter, then her 40th. She urged him to fight the infection, to survive the brutal winter, to come to Aylesham and taste Mrs. Micah. Gable's burnt bread for himself. She realized, with a terrifying clarity that stole her breath, that she was falling in love with a ghost. A man whose face she had never seen, whose voice she had never heard, but whose soul resonated perfectly with hers across a continent. Letter 47 was dispatched in early April. It was her most vulnerable confession, stained with her own tears. She wrote, "Tabitha, if you must leave this earth, know that you do not leave it unloved. My heart has crossed the ocean to sit beside your cot. If you survive, find me. If you do not, I will mourn you as a widow mourns her true husband." Spring finally thawed the frozen earth of Aylesham, but a bitter frost settled permanently over Bathsheba's heart. May arrived bringing blooming daffodils and the return of the fishing fleets to the harbour, but no letters arrived from Turkey. June passed in agonizing slowness, stretching the days into intolerable lengths. July brought only the stifling summer heat. The silence was absolute and terrifying. Bathsheba checked the post office every morning, standing before the wooden counter until Mrs. Higgins, the elderly postmistress, would slowly shake her head with a deeply sympathetic grimace. August 14th was a day that would brand itself into Bathsheba's memory forever. Mrs. Higgins did not shake her head that morning. Instead, she reached beneath the counter and placed a heavy brown paper parcel on the worn wood. It was tied with a coarse, rough piece of twine. Bathsheba recognized her own elegant handwriting on the top envelope. Her stomach plummeted into an abyssal void, the air rushing from her lungs. Retreating to her bedroom without speaking a word to her father, she used a pair of silver sewing scissors to cut the twine. All 47 of her letters spilled onto her floral quilt. They were dog-eared, stained with spilled tea, dark dirt, and grim rust-colored spots that she knew with sickening certainty were blood. At the bottom of the pile lay a single piece of stiff, formal parchment bearing the official seal of the Military Medical Corps. Dr. Alistair Finch had written a brief, terribly clinical note. To Miss Bathsheba Linfield, it is my solemn duty to inform you that Corporal Tabitha Ridge succumbed to his wounds and a subsequent outbreak of cholera in our ward. His final request was that these letters be returned to you. He stated he was entirely unworthy to take such beautiful sentiments into the dark with him. He passed peacefully on the 4th of May. Grief, profound and debilitating, shattered Bathsheba. She packed away her bright dresses and wore stark black, much to the confusion and subtle judgment of the village. They gossiped behind their hands in the market. How could a respectable woman mourn a stranger she had never laid eyes upon? Her father, Charles, grew deeply concerned for her sanity. He urged her to put away the letters, to burn them in the hearth, and to join the realm of the living before her youth withered away. Josiah Sterling, a wealthy textile merchant from the neighboring town of Dover, saw her mourning as an opportune moment to strike. He was a practical, profoundly cold man who viewed Bathsheba not as a woman, but as an elegant, quiet asset perfect for managing his large estate. He began calling on her frequently, bringing expensive gifts of imported silk and heavily sugared fruit preserves. He sat in her parlor speaking endlessly of investments, shipping routes and property lines, completely ignoring the hollow, devastated look in her eyes. Refusing his clinical proposals became a weekly battle. Bathsheba clung desperately to the memory of Tabitha. She spent her evenings reading her own returned letters, tracing the dark stains left by his hands, weeping for a future that had been stolen by a musket ball and a cholera outbreak. She accepted her fate. She would live the rest of her days as a phantom, haunting her father's house, devoted eternally to a grave thousands of miles away in a foreign land. Autumn painted the trees of Elisham in violent shades of red and gold. It was late October, nearly a full year since she had sent her very first letter, when a tempest blew in from the harsh coast. Gale-force winds rattled the window panes of the cottage, and the sky turned a dark, bruised purple. Bathsheba was alone in the parlor, mending a torn hem by the firelight, when the unmistakable clatter of heavy hooves and iron-rimmed wooden wheels sounded over the howling wind. Carriages rarely braved Aylsham in a storm, let alone ones of this massive magnitude. Peering through the ring-streaked glass, Bathsheba saw a magnificent black lacquered carriage, drawn by 4 massive Frisian horses. The vehicle bore a grand crest on its door, a gilded lion, rampant, a symbol of high nobility. The driver, completely soaked by the downpour, leapt down to violently wrench open the carriage door. Stepping out into the thick mud was a man tall enough to duck under the carriage frame. He wore a heavy wool greatcoat, its thick collar turned up against the biting wind. He walked with a pronounced painful limp, leaning heavily on a solid silver-tipped cane. Bathsheba watched, her breath catching violently in her throat, as the stranger unlatched her wooden front gate and approached her porch with a determined, agonizing stride. Clutched in his left hand was a single, crumpled piece of paper. Even through the storm, it looked identical to the stationery she used for her letters. A heavy, commanding knock struck her door, vibrating powerfully through the floorboards and rattling the clock weights on the walls. Trembling uncontrollably, Bathsheba walked to the entryway. She undid the iron latch and pulled a heavy oak door open. The man standing before her possessed a handsome face carved by immense suffering. He had piercing, storm-gray eyes, a sharp jawline dusted with dark stubble, and a pale complexion that spoke of long confinement indoors. His breathing was labored, and he looked at her with an intensity that pinned her instantly to the spot. Miss Bathsheba Linfield. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, rough as grinding stones, yet bearing the unmistakable cadence of the aristocracy. "I am she," Bathsheba whispered, gripping the door frame so tightly her knuckles turned white to keep from collapsing. "Who are you? What do you want?" The tall stranger looked down at the crumpled paper in his hand, then back up to meet her terrified eyes. He removed his sodden top hat, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect and deep sorrow. "You were told Corporal Tabitha Ridge perished in the filth of Scutari," the man said softly, raw emotion cracking his aristocratic voice. "And it is the truth. The real Corporal Ridge died on the cot directly beside mine. In the chaos of the hospital, we traded places, we traded names." He took a painful, shuddering step forward into the warm light of her hallway. "Forgive me, Bathsheba. I am Alva Walsh, the Duke of Somerset, and I have crossed an ocean to finally taste Mrs. Gable's burnt bread." Paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the moment, Bathsheba stared at the towering aristocrat, dripping rainwater onto her woven parlor rug. The ticking of her father's clocks, usually a comforting rhythm, now sounded like deafening hammer strikes in the suffocating silence of the room. The man claiming to be Alva Walsh, the Duke of Somerset, stood before her holding the very parchment she had wept over months ago. Shock violently gave way to a burning, indignant fury. Bathsheba stepped back, her morning dress rustling harshly against the floorboards. "You are lying," she breathed, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with a sudden, sharp anger. "Corporal Tabitha Ridge is dead. Doctor." Alistair Finch confirmed it. "I saw the stains on my letters. How dare you come into my home masquerading as a ghost to mock my grief?" "Get out." Alva did not flinch. Instead, he leaned heavily on his silver-tipped cane, his storm-grey eyes fixed upon her with a desperation that mirrored her own past torments. "I am not mocking you, Miss Linfield. I am throwing myself at your mercy. Please, allow me to explain." He unbuttoned his heavy, soaked greatcoat, revealing fine, tailored waistcoats that belonged in the drawing-rooms of Mayfair, not a modest coastal cottage. Yet, beneath the expensive wool, his posture was that of a broken soldier. "I was Captain Alva Walsh of the 11th Hussars," he began, his gravelly voice competing with the howling wind outside. "I commanded a cavalry unit during the charge at Balaclava. It was a massacre. We were cut down, torn apart by cannon fire. I was severely wounded, my leg shattered, my ribs crushed. They transported me to the hellish wards of Scutari. I was placed on a filthy, disease-ridden cot next to a young, terrified enlisted man. His name was Corporal Tabitha Ridge." Bathsheba crossed her arms, her fingernails digging painfully into her own flesh. "Go on." "Tabitha was a good lad, but he was illiterate," Alva continued, his gaze dropping to the floor as the memories swallowed him. "When your first letter arrived, brought by Sister Margaret, Tabitha held it like a sacred relic, but he could not read a single word. He begged me to read it to him. I was lying there waiting to die, entirely consumed by the futility of the war and the bitter emptiness of my own aristocratic life back in London. My father, the 7th Duke, was a tyrant who viewed me only as a political pawn. I had nothing to live for, but then I read your words." Alva took a slow, agonizing step closer. "You wrote of Mrs. Gable's burnt sourdough. You wrote of Barnaby, the three-legged dog. You wrote of the sea salt and the pine. Your letter was so vivid, so beautifully human, that it pierced through the stench of decay and despair in that ward." Tabitha smiled, but he never heard another word from you. He passed away quietly the very next morning before dawn. Tears sprang unbidden to Bathsheba's eyes. "Then why? Why did you write back? Why did you steal his name?" "Because I was starving, Bathsheba," Alva confessed, his voice breaking with raw, unfiltered emotion. "I was starving for the warmth your letter possessed. I knew if I wrote back as Captain Walsh, heir to a dukedom, you would retreat behind the formal, rigid manners dictated by our society. You would write to me out of duty, not out of the pure, unfiltered honesty you offered a dying commoner. So, when Sister Margaret came to collect Tabitha's effects, I kept the letter. When my fever broke, I wrote back as him. It was a momentary deception born of pure desperation, but as your letters kept arriving, it became my only lifeline." He held up the crumpled piece of paper in his hand. "It was letter 47. I read this letter every single day. You gave me a reason to fight the infection. You gave me a reason to endure the surgeries. But my deception caught up to me. In late April, I contracted cholera. I fell into a deep coma. The military doctors, assuming I would not survive, evacuated me to a specialized officers' hospital in Malta. In the chaos of my sudden transfer, my personal effects were left behind on my cot." Hey! Realization dawned on Bathsheba, hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "Dr. Finch." Dr. Finch was conducting a routine sweep of the deceased patient's belongings. Alva nodded gravely. "He found your letters stuffed beneath the mattress of the cot where Corporal Ridge had initially died. Matching the letters to Tabitha's official record of death, Dr. Finch dutifully mailed them back to you, entirely unaware that the man who had been reading them, the man who had fallen deeply, irrevocably in love with you, was unconscious on a ship bound for Malta." Bathsheba collapsed into the armchair by the fire, burying her face in her hands. The sheer magnitude of the tragedy, The agonizing misunderstanding of it all was too much to bear. She had mourned him. She had given up her life for him. When I awoke in Malta, weeks had passed, Alva said softly, moving to stand beside her chair. I learned that my father and my older brother had both perished while I was away. I was suddenly the 8th Duke of Somerset, burdened with estates, titles, and a suffocating legacy I never wanted. But my only thought was of you. It took me months to recover enough to travel, and even longer to employ investigators from Bow Street to track down the origin of your letters, for I had lost the envelopes. But I found you. I am here, Bathsheba. I am yours, if you can ever forgive me. Before Bathsheba could answer, the heavy wooden door of the parlor swung open. Her father, Charles, stood in the doorway looking bewildered at the towering, soaked nobleman. Behind Charles, however, stood a far more unwelcome figure. Josiah Sterling, the wealthy merchant who had been relentlessly pursuing Bathsheba, had arrived to take shelter from the storm. Josiah's sharp, calculating eyes darted from Alva's expensive coat to his silver cane, and finally to the tears streaming down Bathsheba's face. "What is the meaning of this?" Josiah demanded, puffing out his chest. "Sir, I do not know who you are, but you are upsetting my future bride. I demand you leave this house at once." Alva turned slowly. The vulnerability in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, commanding authority of a British duke. "Your future bride," Alva repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "I suggest you step carefully, sir. You are speaking to Alva Walsh, the Duke of Somerset, and I have crossed a continent and an ocean to claim the woman who holds my heart. You will leave this house, or I will have my footman throw you out into the mud." The revelation of Alva's identity sent shockwaves not just through the small coastal village of Aylsham, but across the highest echelons of British society. Josiah Sterling, humiliated and enraged by his dismissal, did not retreat quietly. A man of immense vindictiveness, Josiah recognized that while he could not challenge a duke to a duel or ruin him financially, he could destroy the one thing Alva valued most, Bathsheba's reputation. Josiah traveled immediately to London. Utilizing his vast merchant wealth, he bribed a clerk at the local post office to secure the details of the correspondence. Within a fortnight, the Morning Chronicle, a widely circulated London broadsheet, published a scandalous, sensationalized exposé. The headline screamed, "The Duke's Peasant Phantom, How the Lord of Somerset Played a Cruel Hoax on a Country Spinster." The article painted Alva as a cruel, bored aristocrat who had impersonated a dead war hero to toy with the affections of a naive, low-born cockmaker's daughter. It claimed Bathsheba was a delusional, tragic figure, entirely unfit for polite society, who had thrown herself at a nobleman under false pretenses. The backlash was instantaneous and brutal. In Aylsham, the villagers who had once pitied Bathsheba now whispered cruel judgments as she walked through the market. They accused her of being a social climber, a shameless opportunist who had orchestrated the entire affair to trap a wealthy lord. Worse still was the arrival of the Dowager Duchess of Somerset, Lady Eleanor Walsh. Alva's mother was a terrifying force of Victorian aristocratic snobbery. She descended upon Aylsham in a convoy of carriages, marching into the Linfield cottage adorned in black silk and dripping with pearls. "You will end this farce immediately," the Dowager Duchess commanded Alva, entirely ignoring Bathsheba and Charles, who stood quietly by the hearth. "You are making a mockery of the Walsh name. You will return to London. You will marry Lady Genevieve, as it was arranged before the war, and you will leave this rural embarrassment behind." Alva gripped his silver cane, stepping protectively in front of Bathsheba. "Mother, I am the Duke. I dictate the future of the Walsh name. I survived the slaughter of Balaclava, and I survived the pestilence of Scutari. I did not fight my way back from the grave to be dictated to by the very society that sent me there to die. I will marry Bathsheba Linfield, or I will abdicate the estate to my cousin and leave England entirely." Lady Eleanor sneered. "If you marry her, she will be an outcast. No respectable household will receive her. She will be isolated, mocked, and destroyed by the very circles she attempts to enter. Is that the life you wish to give the woman you claim to love?" The dowager's words struck Bathsheba with icy precision. She looked at Alva, seeing the immense weight of his title bearing down upon him. She loved him deeply, passionately, but she could not be the architect of his ruin. That evening, as the dowager retired to the local inn, Bathsheba sat Alva down by the fire. "Your mother is right," Bathsheba said, her voice breaking. "Alva, I wrote those letters to a corporal with nothing to his name. I did not write them to the Duke of Somerset. I cannot survive in your world of ballrooms and vicious whispers. And I will not let you throw away your birthright for me." "You must go." "Never," Alva replied fiercely, dropping to his good knee and taking her hands. "Bathsheba, my title is a phantom. It means nothing without you. I will fight them. I will fight them all." But the fight, it turned out, would not be fought with wealth or titles, but with the very thing that had brought them together: words. Determined to clear Bathsheba's name and silence Josiah Sterling's vicious rumors, Alva made a desperate, unprecedented move. He contacted the editor of the London Times, the most respected newspaper in the Empire. He did not offer a denial or a legal threat. Instead, he offered the truth. With Bathsheba's hesitant permission, Alva allowed the Times to publish a selection of her 47 letters alongside his own replies. The publication changed everything overnight. The public, who had been consuming endless political debates and dry casualty reports regarding the Crimean War, was suddenly captivated by this profound, real-life human connection. Bathsheba's words, her descriptions of the simple beauty of England, her vulnerable confessions of loneliness, her fierce encouragement to a dying man resonated with millions. They did not read the letters of a calculating social climber. They read the soul of a devoted, deeply patriotic woman. Alva's replies, revealing his broken spirit and his subsequent salvation through her words, painted a picture of a war hero saved not by medicine, but by love. The clockmaker's daughter became a national symbol of hope. The ultimate victory, however, came from Buckingham Palace. Queen Victoria, who had taken a deep personal interest in the welfare of her soldiers returning from the Crimea, read the published letters. Deeply moved by the story, the Queen sent a royal envoy to Aylsham. On a crisp Tuesday morning, a royal carriage arrived at the Linfield cottage. The envoy presented Bathsheba with a handwritten letter from the Queen herself, praising Bathsheba for her profound kindness to the soldiers of the Empire, and extending a formal invitation for the Duke of Somerset and his future Duchess to attend a royal banquet at Windsor Castle. The Queen's blessing was absolute. It instantly silenced the Dowager Duchess, who could not possibly contradict the monarch. It utterly ruined Josiah Sterling, whose malicious gossip was now viewed as an unpatriotic attack on a woman favored by the crown. His merchant contracts in London dried up within a month, forcing him into bitter obscurity. 6 weeks later, Aylsham witnessed a wedding unlike any in its history. Bathsheba wore a stunning gown of ivory silk, walking down the aisle of the village church on the arm of her weeping, overjoyed father. The church was filled with villagers, aristocratic peers, and several surviving veterans of the 11th Hussars who had travelled to honour their former captain. Standing at the altar, Alva Walsh looked healthier, his storm-grey eyes filled with a blinding, absolute joy. When he took Bathsheba's hand, he leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. 47 letters, Alva whispered against her skin, his voice for her ears alone. And I intend to spend the next 47 years trying to prove I am worthy of every single word. Bathsheba smiled. The ghosts of the past finally lay to rest, her heart finding its true home not in the grand halls of a dukedom, but in the arms of the man who had answered her from the dark. Did this Victorian tale of mistaken identity, defying high society and the enduring power of the written word, capture your heart? True love can bridge any distance and conquer any deception. If Bathsheba and Alva's triumphant romance moved you today, please hit that like button, share this incredible historical drama with your fellow hopeless romantics, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking stories of love against all odds.